Na kągi, gan sunkiai visi į paskutinį pranešimą renkasi, bet gal kaip nors susirinks. Manau, palauksim dar kokią minutę ir tada jau pradėsim. Pasinaudosiu progą primindamas, kad tai yra paskutinė prezentacija. Turite feedback formas, kurias galite pildyti arba raštu, arba internetu. Adresas yra pateiktas ant jūsų kortelės. Jas galite pildyti ir po šio pranešimo jau galim bus pradėti dalinti prizus už gerus atsakymus apie konferenciją. Taigi, I believe we should start at the moment. Here is Clem. We are really happy to have him here. I believe he got here really only last day.
Tuesday evening. So.
Okay, great.
Okay, you ready?
Yep.
Okay, thank you for having me here. The shape of testing is changing. Testing is no longer a phase, and quality is everyone's responsibility. Testing has also become a highly skilled and exciting profession to be in. So my name's Clement Pickering. I'm head of testing for Call Credit Information Group. My aim today is to give you an overview of what agile testing is, the differences between agile and traditional approaches. So I know what you're thinking. It's all just testing, right? So how on earth am I going to fill 60 minutes talking about testing? And that's exactly what I was thinking myself. But hopefully I can do it. I've got another 45, 50 minutes to go. And hopefully we can cover some interesting things. So as I said, there's a number of things I'd like to do this afternoon. Talk about agile testing and how it differs from traditional approaches and the underlying principles that really are, in my mind anyway, key to carrying out an agile testing approach. I'm also going to share with you some of our experiences at Call Credit, the kind of challenges we've had in adopting a very different approach to testing from what we used to use traditionally. And something that I've certainly realized, I suppose I've done a number of talks on this subject now, is that there's a number of angles at which we can approach the topic. So we're going to cover those one by one today, throwing in examples and challenges that we've had as we go through. So I'll come on to each of those, but people and mindset, strategy and approach, and then tools and techniques. And then the last thing I've kind of realized recently, which I've just sort of thrown into the presentation at the last minute, makes it sound like I haven't prepared, but that's not the case, is that there's an awful lot of shapes in agile testing. I'll come on to these as we go through, but the way I think about these is just different angles and approaches to looking at the testing that you're carrying out on a project. And again, the fact that they're shapes just makes them memorable, I think, is the key thing. But we'll come on to that later. Okay, so I'll do a little bit about Call Credit, but not turn it into a big sales pitch. Call Credit is a UK-based credit reference agency. So essentially, we work in the sort of financial services industry in the UK, helping businesses and consumers really understand their credit and all things really related to their personal finances and that sort of thing. Allowing companies to vet who they're going to lend money to and that sort of thing, but also from a consumer point of view, managing things like identity fraud and all of those things that are becoming increasingly hot topics. So as an organization, we have now formally adopted a kind of agile methodology, DSDM a turn. I'm not going to go into DSDM a turn today at all. Everything that I say is just more generic I think it's more the kind of principles and values of Agile and Agile testing rather than any specific methodology. But in case anybody's interested, that is the sort of official project management methodology that we follow. To give you a little bit of context as well, which I think will hopefully be useful to some of the examples I give and any questions that I get on and how I answer those. As an organisation, we've grown organically. We're about 1,000 people now as a business. We've grown both organically and also through mergers and acquisitions. So we at one point had a number of different development teams in the business, probably about 7 or 8 separate development areas, each with their own developers, each with their own testers, each with their own ways of doing things. So basically what this meant is when we brought all of this together into one organisation, onto one function, we had very different approaches to how we carried out our testing, really from both extremes, from the kind of no testers at all at one side, just developers cranking out the code, and then on the other extreme, a very rigorous waterfall-style QA department with the emphasis on the QA. So that just gives you a bit of context as to the background of where we've come from. So, people and mindset. I think this is one of the biggest challenges, and it's the reason I've put it first, really. Getting people to realise that actually the way of approaching testing in an agile sense is very different from a traditional approach. And this is, it's almost, you have to get this right or constantly work on this before anything else is really worth thinking about. So I'm going to go through a number of slides. I've almost pitted this as a bit of a comparison between a traditional approach and then a more agile approach, and I'll hopefully explain with some examples as I go through what I mean in each of these cases. So, in a traditional sense, the testers are very much the people, or quality assurance are the people who rubber stamp the product. They're the guys who say, we've assured that there is quality on this. But essentially, I think the thing that's always struck me is actually, in a traditional approach, there's very little the testers can actually do to influence quality. All they can really do is report on it. They're actually fairly powerless to actually influence the quality and have have a key part to play in actually producing quality. It's almost more like they're acting like an audit function as opposed to an integral part of the team. And to me, that's really quite sad. It's not a very interesting job. I mean, who wants to be an auditor? It's a far more, with an agile approach, testers are actually a team member. They're part of the team, and they're able to influence the team in how they approach things. And I think that's a key message as well. Testing, or quality, sorry, is not just testing. There's all sorts of different practices, which again we'll come on to a bit later, that influence quality. It's not just about somebody running some test scripts and then that seemingly creates quality. There's a whole load of approaches that we can use to try and build this in. So again, I think that's one of the first challenges, and I think the term quality assurance, certainly in the UK, can have negative connotations in this way because it creates that divide. It makes one person or one role responsible for quality, when that's actually not the case at all. And it's a bit disrespectful to those other roles, like developers and business analysts and PMs, who all have a part to play in the quality of the system. So to me, really, quality is an attribute and feature of the system that you're building and the way the team approaches things. It's not about one person taking the role of quality police and enforcing that. So assuming we've managed to convince somebody that they can not treat the quality assurance department as a separate team, another traditional kind of setup with testing is that testing happens at the end of the process. So I'm sure that you've all kind of experienced this. And what basically tends to happen is development overruns for all of those reasons that we know it does, and then the testing phase at the end gets squeezed, which basically means loads of it's cut out, and ultimately quality is not going to be as good as it could be, and it's not really a very good result for anyone. The testers don't like it, the company doesn't like it, hopefully the developers don't like it either, because if they take pride in the product, they can see that's not the best way of going about it. So again, a different change of sort of mindset really for Agile is to consider testing as actually an integral part of the process. Trying to get away from thinking of it as a phase at all, and just considering that it's something, that an activity that has to be done as part of building the software, building the solution that you're trying to produce. A couple of kind of anti-patterns here, I suppose, with Agile that teams tend to fall into, and it's very easy to do so. So one is just making it a very mini waterfall, whereby you carry out your iteration of however long that is, and testing only actually takes place in the last few days of that, because the developers are still building everything for the rest of it. Or indeed, other times where you've got the testers completely out of sync, and they're actually one iteration, sprint, whatever, behind the developers. So they're just working, again, in a kind of isolated way to a degree. They're not properly integrated with the team. Testing still isn't part of the process in that setup. It's something that happens after the development's taken place. So the trick, of course, is to try and work on ways of actually integrating it fully into the process, which, of course, can be challenging. But again, hopefully we'll come to some of those things a bit later. So we've talked about the mindset of the kind of advocacy of testing and the getting away from phases. The other thing in a traditional setup is there's quite often animosity or friction between the developers on the team or and the testers, because the testers are thought of as the quality police. They're going to come along and wave a big stick at you and say you've not done this correctly, and all the developers get defensive because they think it's about somebody checking their code, and that, as Armand's was saying earlier, I don't write any bugs in, my code's perfect. Again, this is a sort of, we want to move away from this with an Agile approach. We want a team that really is collaborative and is viewing, as I said earlier, quality as an attribute of the system, something that we're all striving to actually build in. And hopefully if the team itself also subscribes to this and is taking real pride in creating the solution that they're building, then everybody's bought into it. We actually want to do a really good job. We want the customer to be happy and to have a system that's high quality at the end of it. And we shouldn't really need a policeman to have to tell us about that. So it's trying to, again, get away from that idea, that mindset that the testers are somehow there to police things and enforce quality. It's actually something that we're aiming the whole team to adopt that approach. So I put this slide in, and it's got a nice picture of Bradley Wiggins here, who is obviously the Tour de France winner. I'm a big cycling fan, but I'm hoping cycling is popular in Lithuania. Otherwise, my analogy here is going to break down. Essentially, Armand was talking earlier about the idea of people on an Agile team being completely generalist. Hopefully, this strikes the balance, and I think this is something, a key thing that I'm really keen on emphasizing. On an Agile team and a team carrying out an Agile approach to testing, what you're after is people who are specialists. Absolutely, they have their specialism, but they're also willing to turn their hand to other parts of the thing for the good of the whole team. So again, the cycling analogy, where this comes in, of course, is that you have specialists on a cycling team who takes part in, like something like the Tour de France. So Bradley Wiggins is a time trialist. He's got the Olympic gold time trial medal, and that's his specialism. He is very good at going fast on his own. He's not that great at climbing. He's not that great at just sort of being one as a sprinter or being just one of the team. But absolutely, he has to be able to cover 3 weeks of cycling, hundreds of kilometers every single day. And that's the key thing on a cycling team. You have your specialist climbers, you have your specialist sprinters, and your specialist time trial people, but all of them have got to be very good cyclists and able to cover that distance and support each other in the areas that they're not the specialist in. And I suppose to me that's exactly what we're aiming to try and create on an Agile team, and a team that's trying to adopt Agile testing. So for sure the testers are there with their specialism in testing, And that's their aim, is to try and really emphasize those, bring those skills to the table, and to teach the team about how testing can be best carried out. The different approaches, the different tools, that's where their specialist knowledge comes in and the way they think about things. But that doesn't mean nobody else is going to do anything to do with testing, or nobody's going to think about quality. We actually want everybody, in a generalist sense, taking part in that. There's no reason why developers also can't be excellent testers, carry out certain activities, unit testing, or indeed execute other kinds of tests where needed. It's about operating as that team for the good of the overall solution that you're trying to produce. So again, moving away from those functional silos and job boundaries, and actually thinking of themselves as a team member as well as a specialist. Okay, so another key thing I like to try and emphasize in terms of the people and mindset of agile testing is the aim that testers on the team, and indeed the team themselves, are there to try and provide information to the business to support the product that they're doing. So again, this is trying to move away from the idea of somebody signing it off, which essentially is usually some sort of arse-covering exercise, as we say in England, to try and be able to wave a big load of paper at somebody afterwards if it didn't work. What you're really wanting the team to do, and again, the testers are usually the guys on the team who are very good at working out ways of finding out information, summarizing it and putting it forward, is that the whole team actually puts forward a recommendation as to where they're at, and are just open and visible about that. So maybe, you know, how much test coverage have we managed to achieve, what areas of risk are still a little bit we're a bit uncertain on, you know, what things do they think is really they're very confident in as a team, and what things are we less certain about and that we need to make the business aware of. And then it's down to the business. You know, they could take a call to put it live, and it could be for very good business reasons, even if there's a lot of risk. So it could be a new product, they want to hit the market, canvas feedback early, and so having a product of the, you know, with no bugs, of highest quality, is not their driver at that point in time. It's for those guys to make that decision. Equally, if they know it's a very risk-adverse area, again, they may wish to take a different decision, but they're going to base that on the information that the team puts forward. And again, that's something that we have, and I'll come on to a few examples, very much tried to move away from at Call Credit, the idea of QA being a sign-off for the quality. Okay, so that's exactly brings me on to that slide. So again, we've actively done this on a number of projects. The first high-profile one was when we were moving a whole load of our online services between data centers, which, although, you know, obviously not new functionality, was a very high risk, very high, all of our core services on a 24/7 SLA. And we essentially, for that project, produced no QA sign-off. We essentially wrote and put forward a team recommendation that was presented to the directors who were going to make the call about whether to put it live, and they accepted that. They were quite happy with that as a way of doing it. There was no need for somebody to sign bits of paper and sign it off. Other kind of things that, again, I've linked with the kind of people and mindset area. Project team seating. So sometimes the simplest things make the biggest difference. If you've got you've got your testers, your QA team, just sat in a separate area, maybe all together. Originally in Call Credit in Leeds, we had them all on the ground floor, and all the developers were on the 5th floor, which was totally silly. Just created divides between the teams. If you get the people sat together, suddenly all the barriers start to break down, and people start to feel part of their project team. So it's another thing that we try and emphasize, is we have a community of testers, a community of people who are that professional specialism of testers, but not really a separate department. Obviously for HR purposes we do, but for purposes of the way people operate, we really play that down, and it's about being a member of a team producing a software solution. As a professional tester, we then come together and share knowledge and take place in events and so on. But that's a kind of key cultural difference, I suppose, that we've tried to set up. Integrated exit and entry quality process. Again, that fits with my thoughts there on making it an attribute of the system, part of the process. So again, we can use some of the typical agile things like the Scrum boards or Kanban boards to try and actually build in our quality gates, not assigned to any person, but into the process. So as things move across, that they need to go through certain activities. Again, in terms of the people and mindset, it's about trying to break down that it's just one person's role to do that, and it's actually something that the team are aiming to do for the good of the product that they're building. Constant, consistent message, I suppose that's what I'm doing now. I just like to talk about this as often as possible because people frequently just think, it's just testing. But having that message reinforced takes time, and just trying to get people to understand the reasons and the underlying principles behind why we want to operate in this way and the benefits that it can bring, I think it's something that we've found at Call Credit just need to be constantly put out there so that people can just absorb them and continue, just have them reinforced. Events and agile testing. So again, we try and do things like run tester lunches where we just get together and discuss things. Testing dojos we're trying to get off the ground at the moment, where testers can come together and practice tools and testing techniques. Again, this is to kind of reinforce this community of practice that I was talking about. And then the generalizing specialist thing, really, I've already covered. Okay, so I mentioned the 3 sections. So strategy and approach is where I'm going to go next. So how I see this as different, really, from the people and the mindset is this is now getting a bit more practical. So this is actually, well, how are we going to, now that we've kind of got our mindset, we understand what we're trying to achieve in a kind of cultural sense, how are we going to take that and apply it to our projects? What are some of the testing approaches or quality approaches that we can actually then start to put into practice? So again, this is a very specific Call Credit example, and I could have done this maybe as a comparison, but it didn't fit on the slide. Lightweight visible test strategy. So we talked about documentation earlier, about how it shouldn't become no documentation, which is definitely something I've seen in the past happen with Agile. But then your traditional documentation, again, certain parts of the Call Credit testing area used to produce a big heavyweight test strategy document that basically nobody ever read at all. And it was a complete and utter waste of time. So we scrapped that, and instead what we produce these days is a test poster. So we physically print it out and stick it up on the walls, on desks, on whiteboards. And the aim of this is to try and convey useful and visible information about how the team, and again it's a team activity this, is going to approach the testing and quality on that project. So they don't all look like this. The teams are free to kind of make them look whatever they, however they want. But the aim is it provides a window onto what that team are doing. And what we found is it's a really great way to just spark conversation on the testing on a project. People might go, I don't really understand that bit, but then that initiates a conversation around why it is that that testing's happening like that, or the quality approach. And it emphasises some of the activities that the team have basically committed to and bought into as ways that they're going to approach the testing. And it's just doing away with that big Word document that didn't really serve any purpose at all. So again, with a strategy in place, your traditional versus agile kind of a way of approaching testing. And again, I should say, I suppose, actually, a bit of a disclaimer. I'm not from a testing background myself originally. I was a developer. What always used to strike me as very odd was that the testers would say, right, we're going to do 2 test cycles. I'd be like, well, okay, so that you're assuming that I'll make one mistake and then I'll correct it and then it'll be fine. I mean, that's it. That's the only chance we're going to get to actually correct anything. And really, it was a bit of a nonsense. It was, well, surely we're just going to need to test until we've fixed it, and ideally, we want to try and get better at that, so we're not having to do so many of those things. But just kind of planning for a certain number of test cycles, I'd argue now with an agile approach and an agile approach to testing is just obsolete. It doesn't work, and you can't really plan for that, because if you're going to be working in short iterations, producing working software on a regular basis, then you're not able to say, well, we'll only do 2 test cycles and then that's it, we're going home. So the challenge for the team is to come up with ways to accommodate this change and make sure it's not expensive. And of course, that's where we start to bring in things such as automation. continuous integration, things like that, to actually try and allow ourselves to be able to repeat the testing as many times as we possibly can, or as many times as we need to, I suppose I should say, and that gives us that ability to be able to flex. And there's a number of tools and things which I'll mention a bit later that obviously we can try and do that with, but that's very much something that, as part of an approach to testing on an agile project, that you'll come across, is that you're not just going to be able to just do one set of testing. It needs to be repeatable. It needs to be, then that's going to drive the need for automation and so on. So again, I think this came up earlier. I can't remember in one of the presentations I was listening to, the idea about bugs, and there was a good question from the floor about that as well. The aim, to me, with an agile approach, is actually that your best testers, you shouldn't be expecting to measure them on how many bugs they've found, which again to me is an extremely damaging metric to have on a project, measuring testers on the number of defects that they've managed to detect. The best testers are actually going to find no defects because they've managed to prevent them. So the aim here is to get the testers, again, as testing as part of the process, integrated with the team, and that the whole team are looking for ways to actually clarify the requirements through things like acceptance criteria early, use good coding standards, all of those practices that are really going to build that quality in to start off with. And then through doing that, you're obviously going to shift the emphasis away from finding bugs after the event, when it's already going to be more expensive to fix them, to trying to bring them in really as far up front as you can. So again, there's those classic graphs on, again, I can't remember who produced it, probably IBM literature, on cost of fix depending on where it's actually found. And if you find a problem at requirement stage, of course, it's much, much cheaper than it is to fix when you find it in live. That's the worst case, a bug found in live. You've got to go through a whole load of pain to get that out there again, depending on your system. But obviously, if we can get those things built in up front and get the testers focused on trying to prevent bugs, not find them, then that's going to really help. I think a caveat to this is to say that defect management then, and having tools or ways of tracking bugs, obviously doesn't go away. You do need to have that capability. It's always a balance. However, certainly what we've found is the emphasis on that has become significantly lower. So obviously if somebody can just swivel their chair around, talk to a developer and say, oh, this doesn't look like what I was expecting, and then the developer can have a conversation and go, oh yeah, you're right, well maybe let's tweak it, and then the cost of doing that is so much smaller than the cost of logging it into a system that actually all of that drops away. So we've just found the emphasis on things like bug tracking, which we used to talk about a lot, has just really fallen away. So this is the first of my shapes. And again, not a concept of mine, but again, something that I thought I would talk about. So the idea of the quadrants. How many people have heard of the testing quadrants already? Show of hands. Nobody. Fantastic. So agile testing quadrants, again, is something that's they're in a number of books. It's essentially, the way I like to think of it is a way of reflection, looking at your testing on your project. And again, that doesn't just cover the activities that testers are doing, but any activities on the project, looking at those activities and seeing whether they are essentially lowering the risk in these different areas. So what we've got here is a quadrant sort of system where we've got tests that confirm that the system is behaving as expected. So essentially, this is kind of the predetermined stuff. I know I want it to behave like this. So does it meet its requirements? So the bit at the top, the business-facing stuff, is essentially, are we building the right product? If they asked for a car, are we building a car, as opposed to a bike or a plane or something? And those are typically where you'd have your traditional manual kind of tests, or also these days things like BDD, the behavior-driven development, your acceptance criteria fit in that top quadrant. The technology ones are kind of more, are we building it right? So are we making sure we've eliminated bugs where we can? Are we checking boundary conditions? Or have we got a good suite of unit tests in place so that we've got high code coverage? It's providing reassurance to the team and also longer-term sustainability and maintainability of the code base through those tests that fall into the bottom corner. On the other side, the investigation piece is more of the critiquing of the product. So just because the business or the client has asked for a product in a certain way doesn't mean they've got it right. So things like user experience testing, usability testing would fit in that top right corner. So they're things that the business care about and the clients care about, but really are investigative things. So just trying it out, seeing if it works, and that might actually result in changes to the requirements, to the scope, to set things right. Bottom corner, again, that's just more of the technology investigation thing. So resilience, maybe performance, although that maybe spans across there. Security, pen testing, that kind of thing. Well, that's, you know, when we investigate this, is it telling us anything that we weren't expecting to know? I think the key thing with this shape, and again I'll come on to a few more, is really that if you use this to look at your tests, to reflect on the approach that you're taking to building quality in, if you're missing something, missing one of these quadrants, then that just kind of allows the team to reflect and think, is that a bit of a risk? Are all our tests falling in the bottom corner and we haven't covered everything else? That could then be a risk and something that the team could address. So I said there'd be a number of shapes. There'll be 4 in total, so see if you can spot them. This is number 2. This is, again, just another way of reflecting on how you're approaching your project. How are you approaching testing and quality? Again, that was a Dan North conference. Dan North's a guy in the UK who's a very well-known agile speaker and practitioner. He was introducing this course that I was on. But again, I thought it was a really useful way of looking at different types of testing and what they're aiming to do. So we've essentially got 4 quadrants again, I suppose 4 corners. The vertical axis, I can use the pointer here, is basically saying, are your tests manual or are they automated? The horizontal axis is really saying, and are they deterministic tests? Are they basically trying to prove something that we already know and we're just checking that is the case? Or are they random? Are they trying to uncover something that we don't know at this point? So it's really, we have no idea what we're going to find out, but it will be useful potentially when we find it out. And then we can look at the different types of testing that we're using on a project and see where they fit. So I've just tried to highlight here, you know, kind of where some of your classic types of testing would fit. So again, a lot of your automated things these days, unit testing, BDD, spec by example type stuff, will all frequently fall there. We've got a predefined set of ideas about how we think this system should be behaving. We've automated some tests to prove it, and there they are. At the manual end of that scale, you may actually have things like usability and accessibility. So again, you might need to check that it will work with screen readers rather than just rendered through a browser. It might need to be usable or in different languages, perhaps, all those kind of things. They're typically things that are extremely hard to automate because you need some human consciousness to be able to actually assess them. They fit in that top corner. On your more random side, then, we have essentially what I like to call the unknown tests. So we don't know what we don't know, but it's probably a good idea to see if we can find some of that out, because that's quite often what catches us out. So things like exploratory testing will kind of span a whole range, but some exploratory tests that people would be doing might just be trying to find out, well, I wonder what happens if I do this. Down in the bottom corner, again, we have tools like fuzz testing tools, if anybody's come across those. Just tools that allow you to do things like just inject vast amounts of essentially crap into a system and see what happens. So some security tests can be done like that, but you find out all sorts of things there that you maybe never would have known if you hadn't tried to do that. And again, it's a tool for reflecting on the testing that you're doing. A lot of teams have the / axis, as I tried to think of a term for it earlier, well covered. So, you know, yep, we've got some automated unit tests in and some automated component level tests, etc., and we're doing some exploratory testing and some up here. But frequently, actually, what gets forgotten is this kind of access here. So we're not actually checking some of those things, perhaps, or really we haven't thought about what would happen if the system is used in a way that we hadn't really thought about. Okay, shape number 3, still on time, I think. And this one's my own idea, so no need to reference this, so feel free to tweet about this if it's good. So the idea with this was thinking about a blanket, a security blanket, as it were, for your project in terms of testing. So frequently people talk about safety nets for oh yeah, we don't. If we've got a problem, the testers will find it. They're our safety net. Obviously, nets are typically full of holes though, and stuff gets through them, especially if they're small. So I thought a blanket was really a better analogy. But again, it's really just another shape that you can use to analyze the testing that you're doing on a project and think about whether it's appropriate to the situation. So I think things like smoke testing, if you're smoke testing or regression testing, you've maybe only changed a very small part of the functionality, and then you're aiming just to verify that the system still hangs together. They're typically, what you want there is a broad sort of sweep of tests. So something that checks every part of the system is still working okay, but doesn't really need to go into any depth. And so what I mean by that really, I suppose, is that as long as you've tested that, yep, you can log on okay, you can access the search screens, you can access the report and it comes back okay, those are all tests that are just checking, yep, everything still looks fine. They're a broad sweep of tests, and they're appropriate in given situations like deployments, smoke, that kind of regression sort of stuff. Obviously, if you're building a new feature, though, you want a lot of test depth around that. And so that's going to be where you're actually trying to aim to prove that the feature is really behaving in all sorts of different ways and under increasingly strange boundary conditions or those things I was referring to on the previous one. So obviously, dependent on your situation, you should be thinking, well, have we got this covered? If we're building a new feature and we're only running a few kind of high-level tests, we're running a bit of a risk, perhaps, that it's not going to work okay. But likewise, if you're deploying regularly and you're trying to go into every detail of tests there, it's just going to take a lot of time and be not very effective. So conscious of time, but a couple of things, examples from Core Credit. As I've mentioned, the test strategy posters already. In terms of the bugs and things, we actually have a sort of policy of where if we find bugs early in things like our integration environments, system test environments, where essentially the team is deploying regularly and rapidly to those environments, then there is no need to log a bug. We actively say, well, that's fine. If you can just prevent it or have a quick chat with the dev and fix it rapidly, then that's absolutely fine. It's only when we move on to our more formal environments that we're actually saying, yes, we ought to be logging bugs. Or it's a memory aid as well. If you think, oh, we're not going to be able to fix this straight away, then yep, log it so that we don't forget about it. Test first development I've put down as well. Again, we don't have any policy that says everybody must do TDD or everybody should use behavior-driven development. But generally, as a policy, we are aiming to try and get test first development. So have you thought about writing a test first in some form or other to actually prove, or so that you know when you've developed the functionality that it's either fixed the problem that you were aiming to do so, or that it's building the right feature. And again, we're still at the moment, we very much try and have the approach that the team is empowered to choose their approach. We're not trying to be draconian and make every team have the same approach. As long as they've considered things from different angles and they can support that, they can be open and visible about how they're approaching it, then that's fine by me certainly, and that's how I think that hopefully yields the best results if teams really feel bought into the way that they're approaching things. So the final of the 3 sections, tools and techniques. So again, I wasn't intending today to go into any kind of great detail about how we use any specific tools and things, but more than happy to talk to people afterwards if they've got any specific tool kind of questions. In fact, I think the presentation before was very much probably on that topic, but I couldn't understand a word of it. So I think one of the key messages that we have at Core Credit, again, is that we aren't a one-tool-fits-all kind of thing. In the past, for example, a company might adopt a particular testing tool. We used to use Quality Center in the past, and just try and carry out all testing with that tool. But again, it strikes me that that's not a particularly good way of doing things. If frequently, if you were a plumber or handyman of some sort, you wouldn't just turn up with one adjustable spanner and think, right, I'm going to be able to sort everything with this. You would probably have a toolbox of specialist tools to use for different purposes. And again, another analogy that springs to mind here is with code, with developers. We don't attempt to write every system using .NET across the board. You'd be absolutely crazy to do that. There are specialist kind of languages for different things. So obviously, if you're in databases, there's T-SQL, SQL code. Front ends these days, websites are becoming increasingly more sophisticated, JavaScript, CSS. All sorts of new languages are emerging all the time, and people are adopting them because they're very well suited to a specific purpose. You wouldn't want to be constrained as a developer by being told you had to code everything in one language, even if it wasn't the right thing for the application you were building. So really, again, what we're aiming to do, and what we have done at Call Credit, is adopt a range of tools, choosing the right tool for the right job. Final testing shape of the afternoon, the testing pyramid. Now, surely people have heard of the testing pyramid. Show of hands. 1. Thank you, Remigis. 2. Brilliant. 3. Oh, excellent. This is getting better. Vidus as well. Brilliant. Several people work at Call Credit. Okay, so the test pyramid, again, is something I think Lisa Crispin, Janet Gregory came up with originally. They wrote a book on agile testing, which is a really excellent book. The aim of this pyramid is to do a number of things, I suppose. Firstly, to me, it's about a layered approach to testing. It's about understanding that a system does not just present itself through its front end, through its user interface, for example. It's actually a series of layers, typically, depending on your architecture, and there's different ways that you can best test a system depending on what you're trying to prove. The other thing it's trying to do, besides show those layers, is show levels of automation. So that's the reason it goes from wide at the bottom to very narrow at the top, because it's suggesting that is the most effective use of automation. Frequently, companies actually have that the wrong way up. So a number of companies, for example, might have no unit tests in place whatsoever, and we, in fact, did have this for some of our systems. Absolutely no unit tests whatsoever, nothing at all, apart from a load of brittly automated user interface tests. So maybe the test team had adopted a record and playback tool like Selenium or Quality Center QTP and just recorded loads of actions through the UI. So you've essentially got, it's not even an upside down pyramid, it's more of a strange T-shape where you've just got this huge level of automation through the UI and nothing below it. And the problem with that is it's very brittle. Every time the user interface changes, all your tests start failing, and then you have to, it's a huge maintenance overhead to keep on top of that. The idea with this is we actually try and build, the further down we can automate, the better. So it's really broadly sort of suggesting that we should have a very wide coverage of unit tests. Everything really, as much as we can, should have unit tests wrapped around it, and we can prove all sorts of useful stuff at that stage. Boundary conditions, error exceptions, all sorts of stuff that can be proved at that point, and then don't really need double-checked again further up. We then have the different layers above that. The component level is quite often now, you can use a BDD tool perhaps to automate around that. Above that, certainly with some of our systems, with our sort of typical end-tier architecture, there will be some sort of service level, so either publicly exposed or at least some sort of code API that we can test against. We can actually use tools to test against those APIs, and they tend to be a bit more contract-based. They're not going to change as frequently or have as much implication for the automated tests if they do change. Obviously, then we have the UI above that, and we can still do some levels of automation and use some tools around that. And then there's this exploratory layer that we can really add in anywhere we want. Okay, so a few more minutes. I won't say too much on this one. Automate and integrate. I think this is obvious, and again, I think the presentation before mine covered this in some depth, the one in here. Test automation, of course, with Agile, with that need to be able to repeat your test cycles is very key. Trying to adopt a focus of automating your tests, but then also integrating them into your build cycles, manually perhaps at first, but then increasingly using kind of continuous integration tools will be really useful in terms of being able to have a sound sense of whether your project's covered and also be able to adapt to change, as we talked about earlier. So again, it's using some of the tools that were mentioned on the previous slide. Again, we could probably spend the whole afternoon talking about tools. But it's more, I think, what I wanted to talk about here was just the idea of the technique of automating and then integrating those tests as much as possible into that testing cycle. And that pretty much sums up, I think that's, again, some of the examples of things that we cover, that we use ourselves specifically at the moment. A range of things. We definitely try and approach things with that layered approach in mind. And where possible, we've tried to start using continuous integration very successfully on some, and we've still got a bit of work to do on other projects. Okay. Oh, that went faster than expected. So final slide, I suppose, just to sum up really what I hopefully have managed to get across this afternoon, is really about how Agile testing is different from a modern approach, that it isn't just testing just done in an Agile project life cycle. It actually, there's a number of fundamental reasons why it's just a very different approach to how you approach things. The mindset thing to me, again, is key. That if you don't have that in place, it's always going to be a bit of a struggle to get the team and the business to actually realise why this is a better way of working, and also to properly reap the benefits of working in that way. I think it's certainly as well for as a profession, because of all these changes, becoming a far more exciting and dynamic career. Technically, yes, more challenging, but again, I think in a good way, testers can build up a really sound set of skills and have those skills really held in high regard within the teams and add a lot of value to the projects. I suppose I'll conclude, as I said at the bottom, that the cultural thing is almost the hardest thing to change. If you manage to do that, then hopefully all the rest will follow on nicely. Okay, thank you very much for your time. Has anybody got any questions? Again, surely somebody must have a question. In English, please, though. Yes?
Hi, you told that you had this cultural change in your organization. The question would be, was it top-bottom or bottom-top?
Okay, interesting. And again, I would say it's something that we're still working on. I think that's the thing. So yes, I think top-down sponsorship is pretty important. Certainly with the history of Agile in general at Cole Credit, it started as a bottom-up thing. So we originally had started using Agile in sort of development teams. Then the testers started to get involved. It was, it grew from the bottom up. But I think, yeah, to really take it forward, you need to have that top-down sponsorship. And again, I suppose that's why I'm trying to highlight that the cultural aspects are often the hardest. Because, yeah, if you're pushing against a company that's saying, no, we want our separate QA team and we want it to sign everything off, and no, the testers can't sit with the developers, they'll distract them, then that's going to be pretty challenging. So, and it's going to be hard to actually influence that if you haven't got that top-down sponsorship. But again, I think to a degree, it's also, as long as they're willing and accommodating and saying, okay, right, well, let's try these different things, then it's over to the teams and to the testers and to, well, everybody, I suppose, involved to be able to then put it into practice. You don't need the top to dictate how you go about doing it. They just need to be bought in, I think is how I'd answer that.
I have one specific question. Since as I always program by myself, and most times I just do testing also in a environment. If I want to do something, is it really what I want to do? And sometimes when I was like starting only in the bigger projects, it was like I start with that. I know what I have to do, and then through the testing, I go that way.
Okay.
And I had to be here. I am here.
Yes.
How do you prevent that from happening? Since when you go into the details, if have I done this correct, I go to one or another side, since I lose focus on what I have to reach, since there are a lot of steps.
Yes. Okay. I suppose I would. That's again where I'd come back to those shapes. Really, as I suppose a means of reflecting on what you're doing, because I think if I'm understanding correctly, yeah, as a developer, if you're working alone and you are testing, so let's say you're following a very proactive kind of approach, you may be even doing TDD, yeah, you can go off down a tangent and lose sight of what you're trying to produce. And I think that's where some of those shapes came in, was to say, well, hang on, if all of your tests are actually just automated, deterministic stuff, or they're all about making sure it's built right, for example, so that you haven't got any bugs, the boundary conditions are all okay, all that sort of stuff, then you've still lost sight of some of those other things. Are you actually building the right thing? So again, using my silly analogy earlier, you might end up having built an absolutely amazing motorbike, but then actually they wanted a car. So it doesn't matter how good it is, it's not what they wanted. So I suppose I'd just say that those shapes as a tool for reflection are really useful. If you can look at what you're building and saying, well, hang on, everything I'm doing is in that sense. I wonder what happens if I considered things from a different angle, different points of view. Then maybe that would allow you to kind of correct yourself and and come back on in the right track. Does that kind of answer it a bit? Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Nope. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much again.
So then, thank you very much. Also,
you.
small gift from us.
Get my commemorative plates. Thank you. Excellent.
Great.